Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Nobuhiro Hosoe, as the Dean of the National Graduate Institute for Policy Studies. It is my great pleasure to welcome you all to today's important discussion. So democracy around the world is under threat. We see an erosion of democratic norms, such as freedom, fairness, and liberties. So these threats to democracies are being driven by a range of global trends. So there is a heightening tension today between liberalism and equality, between traditional versus new media, and between demographic groups. So they have been exacerbated by shocks to the system, such as COVID-19, war in Europe and Middle East, tariff wars, and spiking inflation. So the democratic backsliding is that we see today is accompanied by an authoritarian resurgence. So there is no doubt we are in the age of uncertainty. So luckily, we have a panel of distinguished scholars to help us to understand this complexity and uncertainty. So our keynote speaker is Professor Francis Fukuyama, a senior fellow and director at Stanford University's Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies. He is the author of 14 books and countless articles. So among them, his 1992 book, The End of History and the Last Man, is a staple in the international relations discipline. He argues that democracy represents the end point of mankind's ideological evolution and universalization of Western liberal democracy as the final form of human government. His latest book, published in 2022, is Liberalism and its discontents. In it, he surveys a long list of dissatisfactions facing the liberal order and offers a spirited defense for revitalized liberalism that is better designed for the 21st century. So there is no one better position to reflect on today's democratic state of affairs than Professor Fukuyama. It is a true pleasure to have him with us today. We will organize this special lecture opportunity with my three GRIPS colleagues. Professor Iwamo Yoko is the director of our Strategic Studies program at GRIPS and scholar of European politics and security. Professor Takenaka Harukata is a scholar of Japanese politics and security. Professor Matthew Brammer, a faculty member in our Science, Technology, and Innovation Policy Program and Associate Director of GRIPS Global Leadership Development Program, will serve as today's moderator. So with that, I welcome you again, and thank you very much, and let's begin.
Yes, please. Tell us, what is happening in America?
Okay, well, thank you very much. It's really wonderful to be able to be here at GRIPS and to talk to you about the current world situation. I will talk about the re-election of Donald Trump. I think that it has an unfortunate way of fitting into the global backsliding of democracy that the Dean just outlined, because You know, the year of elections this past year in many ways was not that bad. There were a number of elections, the Polish election, the Indian election, and so forth, where you had populist nationalist leaders that were actually set back and defeated or pushed back by more liberal parties. I wrote about this in Foreign Affairs, and I said the most important election of all of them is going to be the one in the United States on November 5th, and that will determine the overall judgment of this past year. In my view, it was not a good outcome for global democracy given the position of the United States. So I want to talk, just make some points about the significance of the election and why it turned out the way it did. Just about the election itself, the pollsters were really wrong for the third presidential election in a row. They all said that it was going to be a very tight election. You're probably aware that American elections are not determined by a popular vote, but by the Electoral College, meaning that there are about 6 swing states that will really determine the winner. And the pollsters were saying it was a very tight race between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump, and it turned out to be nothing of the sort. It was a decisive victory for Donald Trump. So he won all of the 6 swing states. He won the popular vote. He won a majority of the popular vote. He's the first Republican candidate to have done that since 2020. Since 2004. So it's 20 years since a Republican candidate has done that well. The Republicans did well in a lot of the down ballot races as well. They took control of both the House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate. And so you have when you add the conservative Supreme Court that Donald Trump put in place in his first term, you have the Republicans controlling all of the major institutions of American government. Now, in my view, this is not good for global liberal democracy, because I do not believe that Donald Trump really believes particularly in liberal democracy. He is the only major candidate and politician in American history who has not been willing to step down after he lost an election. And that is much more serious than any policy, any particular policy that he may have advocated, because this strikes at the very heart of the democratic system, the peaceful transfer of power. He denied that he lost the 2020 election, and for the 4 years after that, he's managed to persuade something like 70% of the Republican Party that Joe Biden was an illegitimate president because he won by fraud. All of this total nonsense, but he's persisted in that, which has led to a serious deterioration in people's confidence in their own institutions. In terms of the policies that he's advocated, he's gotten much more radical since he was elected in 2016. Back then, he talked about building a wall to keep migrants from coming into the United States. This time around, he's talking about mass expulsions of illegal immigrants. There are about 11 million, something over 11 million of them. And he is talking about building camps, rounding them up, putting them in these camps, and then sending them back to the countries from which they came, including many who've been in the United States for 20 years, whose children are American citizens. By the way, he's also talked about abolishing birthright citizenship, so he would actually, if he could, strip citizenship from a lot of those people. This is something that will affect Japan in particular. He has talked about an escalating level of tariffs, not just against strategic competitors like China, but against all countries, including friendly ones. It had been 10%, now he's talking about 20%. He's talking about abolishing the personal income tax and replacing them with tariffs. So these two measures are so extreme that it's doubtful he could actually implement them. And in foreign policy, he is clearly not committed to allies. He has been very resentful of the NATO allies. He's criticized both Japan and South Korea for not, quote unquote, paying enough for their own protection by the United States, as if these alliances are basically protection rackets. So, that's what he said in the course of this campaign. The big issue, I think, that faces us as Americans and other people outside of America is whether any of this is serious. And I would say that of the people who voted for him, there's maybe a third, 40% that actually support that agenda and voted for him because he wants to expel 11 million illegal immigrants and the like. But there's a substantial number of Republicans that are more moderate and have been saying throughout this election campaign, you people that don't like Donald Trump are suffering from Trump derangement syndrome. He's not that bad. In practice, he will not actually carry out, he likes to talk big and promise all sorts of things, but he didn't carry through on his promises in his first term, and he's not going to do it in his second term. It may, America has checks and balances in its constitutional system that will restrain Donald Trump the second time around. And that's a pretty big assertion that he's actually not going to carry through on any of the rather extreme policies that he's suggested. I personally think that we have to take seriously a lot of these threats to execute some of these policies, and I think that he is more likely to get away with doing that the second term than the first term, which means that the next 4 years are actually going to be worse than the first 4 years. There are several reasons for saying that. The first has just been demonstrated in the past week. His first few appointments to cabinet positions, like Elise Stefanik going to the UN or Marco Rubio, Secretary of State, were not that bad. I mean, these were sort of normal Republicans. They had to toe the line under Trump because of his popularity, but they're the kinds of appointments you can imagine any Republican candidate making. But the ones that he announced most recently are it's hard for me to describe how bad they are because I really don't think that there's any precedent for the kinds of appointments. Let's begin with Tulsi Gabbard, this former congresswoman from Hawaii, who, as far as I can tell, is a Russian agent of influence, and he wants to make her the director of national intelligence. She has never taken a pro-American position supporting any aspect of American foreign policy. She's agreed with Putin that the war started in Ukraine because NATO was threatening Ukraine. She went to Syria as a private citizen, met with Bashar Assad, and said that he was, he's not so terrible, and he's been, cast as a villain, but that was really not correct. And it's going to mean that the American intelligence community is going to be paralyzed for the next 4 years because she would not get a security clearance if she were applying as a normal, to be a normal employee of one of the intelligence agencies. But she's going to be director of the whole thing. The appointment of Peter Hegseth as the Secretary of Defense is just as outrageous. People are, I think that he was taken out of the, he's a reserve officer. He was taken out of the protection for Joe Biden in the 2021 inauguration, because it turns out his body is covered with tattoos of Christian nationalist organizations, and the police were actually afraid that he would not be trustworthy as a protector of the newly elected Joe Biden as President of the United States. His only experience is as a talking head on Fox News, and he is now going to run the largest combined civilian military organization in the world. I keep trying to think which is the worst of these appointments, but the next two are even worse than the first two. So Matt Gaetz as the Attorney General of the United States. This is a young man who barely practiced law after graduating from law school. He was investigated by the FBI for basically sex trafficking. That was quashed for political reasons. The Republicans don't want to release the Ethics Committee report because that report is going to say that he basically paid for prostitutes, was using drugs when he was a congressman. Excuse me. So, but the worst part about him, he's not a serious person. His entire career was spent around defending Donald Trump and attacking fellow Republicans who were not sufficiently pro-Trump. And it's very, very clear the only reason that Trump selected him was he wants revenge. He wants to take revenge on the people that he believes have been persecuting him. And a normal, respectable lawyer would not do this. He's not, such a lawyer would not go after the quote-unquote Biden crime family and try to prosecute Joe Biden for, imaginary crimes that they claim he committed, but Matt Gaetz would. Whether he can get through the Senate is an open question because there's a lot of people that really are pretty appalled by this appointment. But on the other hand, in the past, they've all collapsed. They express privately reservations about a choice that Trump has made, but in the end, they support him. So we'll have to see. And then the final one is Robert F. Kennedy Jr. to head Health and Human Services. I mean, this is like putting the most anti-science person in the United States in charge of all of the country's public health and science agencies, right? He's a vaccine denier, but he's also part of this larger social trend in the United States that believes basically in a whole range of conspiracy theories. He expressed credence in this view that COVID was actually developed as a bioweapon that would not go after Jews and Chinese people. He has questioned, the moon landings and the Kennedy assassination, but he really made his career questioning the efficacy of vaccines, not just the COVID vaccines, but vaccines across the board. And this is the person that Donald Trump wants to put in charge of the Centers for Disease Control, the National Health Service, all of these agencies tasked with guarding American health. So it's not just that they're not qualified, they're kind of anti-qualified. They're qualified in trying to dismantle the behavior of, or the work of these American government agencies. And the damage that these people can do if they are actually confirmed is, it's very hard to calculate. So that gives you an idea about whether we should take the threat of Trump's second term seriously, because he's already shown us that, what his agenda is likely to be. The other thing that makes me particularly worried about what he's going to be able to accomplish in a second term is this so-called Schedule F. So at the end of the first Trump term, the White House issued an executive order creating a new Schedule F for federal employees. At the present moment, federal bureaucrats have a whole series of job protections. For example, the head of the Bureau of Labor Statistics or the head of the Internal Revenue Service are so-called for-cause employees, meaning that they cannot be removed for political reasons. They basically have to kill somebody or rape somebody before they can be taken out of their positions. But Trump would like to convert all of these positions to at-will employment, meaning that they can simply be sacked. And the Heritage Foundation was busy preparing this Project 2025, where they envisioned mass firings of federal bureaucrats that were not sufficiently loyal to Trump and replacing them with Trump appointees. So you just imagine if you had a Matt Gaetz-like person running the Internal Revenue Service. You could order audits of journalists, of CEOs, of heads of NGOs, organizations that Trump didn't like and wanted to take revenge on, and there'd be really no kind of procedural check to their being able to exercise that kind of power. And that alone, and that's the first item. I mean, he's going to do this on day one, reinstate this Schedule F, and therefore, be able to take out, 10,000 federal employees off the, right off the bat. And so it fits this larger conservative move against expertise. A lot of the populism in the United States is expressed in terms of conspiracy theories, outright conspiracy theories, that the world is not as you see it. It's actually being manipulated behind the scenes by elites who do not have your interests at heart and actually want to hurt you. And this. Trump himself indulged in this. He came to political prominence by suggesting that President Obama was not legitimately born in the United States and therefore could not be elected president. And this kind of thinking has really come to virtually define what it means to be a conservative in the United States. So he's really going to be probably the most significant president that we've had since Franklin Roosevelt in many ways, even more so than Ronald Reagan, in terms of taking one of the two major political parties and really transforming it. I guess the last thing I'll say is that everybody then wants to know, why is this happening? And I think that the answer to this would require several sessions like this to go through all of the different reasons, but it does reflect a very important sociological change. A lot of the discussion in the United States in the days since the election have been tactical, that Kamala Harris should have done this instead of that, or, it was these anti-transgender ads that the Republicans ran that really were important. Those may have had an effect, but this was not a close election. This was not an election like the past two where 80,000 votes in certain swing states would have yielded a completely different outcome. This was a pretty decisive shift, and I think the most important sociological change is that the working class or less educated American voters have completely moved, well, not completely, but it used to be the core constituency of the Democratic Party, and they've all moved over to the Republican Party. Again, I keep saying all. Many of them have moved over to the Republican Party. This is something that really began with Ronald Reagan, but it accelerated greatly under Trump. And it's very interesting because Trump was criticized during the election for not trying to broaden his coalition to include more moderate voters, women, suburban women, and so forth. But he did broaden his coalition. What was quite remarkable was the number of minority voters. That includes Asian Americans, African Americans, and particularly Hispanics who voted for Trump. In fact, there's hardly a single ethnic or identity category in the United States where Trump did not increase his vote share, and especially with Hispanics, it was a very significant increase. And that's kind of interesting because the Democrats had been counting on identity categories determining how you were going to vote. Right? So if you were a Hispanic, it meant that you would vote Democratic because you didn't like the anti-immigrant policies of the Republican Party. And it turned out that that's just completely a wrong understanding of what motivates people to vote. In fact, many Hispanics vote just the way that conservative white voters do. They don't like illegal immigration, and they really want to close the borders. They got in legally, and they say, here are the Democrats letting all these people come in when I had to work for my citizenship and, stay in the country and, raise a family and all that, and these people are coming in and they're skipping the line. It's in a funny way, Trump has managed to recreate a multiracial coalition But it's a conservative coalition, and it's a conservative coalition based on working class voters. And so it's not going to go away. I think that Trump is uniquely talented as a demagogue, so it's very hard for people to, he's got a lot of people that wanted to try to imitate him, like Ron DeSantis in Florida, or J.D. Vance, his vice president, but none of them have the charismatic skills that he does. And it's something that's very hard for educated Americans to appreciate, because, to an educated American, he's like the absolutely worst person you can imagine running for president in terms of his character, his dishonesty, his constant grifting and trying to make money off of anything he could, his entire life lying constantly and so forth. But it appeals to a certain, culturally it appeals to a great many Americans, particularly ones that don't have a college education, which is still 60% or more of the American population. And so this phenomenon that he represents is something that has already dramatically reshaped American politics. The Republican Party will never snap back to what it was like before Trump. It's just not going to do that. And anybody that hopes that it will, I think you're going to be very disappointed, because this is a much more profound and deeper change in American society, and therefore in American politics. So with that, I'll stop. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Just to clarify and to use a medical analogy, it sounds like you are saying that Trump is not only the disease, but also the symptom. Is that right?
Yeah, the causality goes both ways. So he's a brilliant demagogue, so he has deepened the existing polarization, but he's also riding on this anti-elitist populist wave that, preceded him and will exist long after he's gone.
Okay. Well, if he's the disease and symptom, then perhaps unintentionally he might be a prescription. After all, we can learn a lot from car crashes, not just the causes and consequences, but also solutions.
Yeah. Oh, by the way, I forgot to say anything about international impacts. But maybe...
Would you like to?
Yeah, well, it's... maybe I should have started with that, because I just think that it's also going to have a profound impact on the global order. We've already seen all of this democratic backsliding in many countries around the world, and this is going to deepen it. So all of the populist parties in Europe are going to take heart from his election. Every American ally, except for Israel, is going to worry about the constancy of American support, because he's expressed a lot of skepticism about the need for allies and, whether the allies are actually doing their share and so forth. In terms of specific areas of the world, I'll leave it to my colleagues to talk about Europe and Japan. In the Middle East, a lot of Arab Americans voted for Trump and against Kamala Harris. Donald Trump just appointed Mike Huckabee to be the ambassador to Israel. Mike Huckabee does not believe that there's such a thing as the West Bank and the Palestinian people, and he's actually supported the annexation of the West Bank by Israel. And so I'm afraid that, in the Middle East, if you thought that Joe Biden was too pro-Israel, you're going to get something much more extreme, under Donald Trump, and that has a lot of implications, because we are just on the cusp of a much larger war between Israel and Iran. So, we'll have to see what happens.
Thank you very much. It is rather jarring, shocking. And in the end, the world works in mysterious ways. And speaking of mysterious, Takenaka-sensei, what is happening in Japanese politics?
Yes, thank you very much for having me in this panel. And it's nice to be with Frank again. Yes, it's not. It's well, something is mysterious, something is not. Well, Japan kind of. We have seen the rise of populism in Europe, in the United States, and we, the Japanese scholars studying Japanese politics, have been often asked by scholars in the States or in Europe, Japan looks very stable. Japanese democracy looks very stable, and why so? But now we had just the election at the end of last month, and the LDP did not do well, and we have now a minority government, as we all know. The Ishiba administration was formed as a minority government on 11th November. This is the first minority government we have seen in 30 years. So I think the politics. Well, I thought I would talk about the kind of the prospects of the Ishiba administration, but I will skip that because Frank raised more serious issues. So I think if I would like to examine if Japanese democracy really faces serious issues. So for some time, I think we will experience unstable politics under Ishiba administration because it is obviously more difficult to formulate policies with a minority government. But it's okay to have one minority government for a certain period of time. You know, the LDP screwed up, but they may recover. They may run the lesson. They may recover a majority, or the opposition party may forming coalitions. But in line with what Frank just has said, if I would like to examine if there is some serious symptoms in Japanese democracy. And I think Japanese democracy is much safer and much stable than and does not suffer serious problems such as deep polarization or affective polarization you see in the States or some countries in Europe. But we have experienced three elections, local and national elections from July. And these three elections demonstrate some serious symptoms we should worry. That in particular, we see signs of the rise of populism and as well as the political mobilizations of those who are deeply disaffected with expansion of economic disparity and their income not rising. And I think we should take this very seriously. And if we can address this issue now, because it's the maybe the symptoms is not so severe, but we should be aware of that certain segment of society, especially the certain segment of young generation, are very much dissatisfied with their economic conditions and living standards. And so let me tell you how I can say this. Okay. Well, in Tokyo governor election in July, former mayor of Takada City performed pretty well. Nobody knows this person. Well, I don't say nobody, but not many people know. Not many people were aware of this person, but he performed very well and he came to the second. Okay? And many people said, oh, he performed pretty well because he used SNS, YouTubes, and Instagrams very effectively. So he attracted and he was very successful in making himself very appealing to the young generation. So young generation voted for him. Okay? Not really serious issues with economic disparity or dissatisfaction with the living standards. Now, in the general election of the October, we see the rise of National Democratic Party. They came up with this issue of raising your income, okay, by lowering the tax. Okay? And this looked, and the NDP, National Democratic Party, made effective use of SNS again. And they caught the heart of those in 20s and 30s. And I went to a social gathering about a week ago, And there are many business person from top tier Japanese companies in the 20s and 30s, and I asked them, which party did you vote? And many people really voted for NDP, saying that they did not want for LDP, but they either did not want to for the Constitutional Democratic Party, that is too left wing, so they chose NDP. But I think NDP looked very attractive because they came up with this platform to raise the income. Okay, 手取り上げます. And then no other party really addressed the issue, economic policy, and the LDP has been saying they will raise the wages, but the effective wages of Japanese people have been going down for almost past 2 and 6 years. So Prime Minister Kishida did not really make a success about raising the income level of the ordinary people. So I think there's a dissatisfaction. And what struck me most is the recent election of Hyogo Prefecture governor election. This former governor who was dismissed by vote of no confidence from the local assembly of Hyogo. No one really thought when the election campaign started that he would win, but he again made effective use of SNS, YouTubes, and Instagrams. But what worries me is the way he fought. He positioned himself as a kind of scapegoat, put forward by the establishment, and so he was a victim of the establishment, and because he tried to carry out reform in the Hyogo prefecture, and so the establishment set him up, and this disseminated the scandals which were not really true, and the young generation supported him because he took this anti-regime position. Okay. So I think, and so it's very scary that, and also, I think that he could catch the heart of those young generation, young people. Many people say that now today. Part of the reason is that the people those in 20s and 30s do not read newspapers, do not watch TVs. They rely on SNS as source of information. This is true, but I sense there is a dissatisfaction about the current regime. Because of this is economy, because of the widening of economic disparity and lowering the effective real income. And for this panel, I did little research, and the Japanese, since Abe administration, LDP administrations have been saying that the economic disparity has not widened if you take the Gini coefficient. But I looked at the most recent report published by the Kosei Rodosho, Economical Welfare and Labor, and compare that statistics with the statistics 5 years ago. The Gini co-index become larger. That is, as a Japanese society as a whole, there's a clear sign that economic disparity is widening. And what is more serious is that economic disparity in the young generation is widening. If you take the Gini co-index of those in 30s, the Gini co-index is larger. That is, young generations in economic disparity among the young generation is widening. So I think Saito-san and his comrades succeeded in mobilizing those young generations who have dissatisfaction for economic reasons, and that's worrisome. And I think if there are more political entrepreneurs notice this symptom or this dissatisfaction, they may do well even in national elections, and the symptom can be detected again in the most recent national elections, because for the first time we have seen, after the World War II, that we have seen that two extreme right-wing political parties receiving about 60% of the vote and succeeded in getting 6 seats in the Diet, and so that is worrisome. And I think these guys these guys succeed in manipulating these disaffected people with SNS, they will gain more seats in the next national elections, and that will be a problem. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. The Hyogo governor example is very interesting. I believe he modeled his strategy after Trump's and calls himself the Japanese Trump. Is that right? The mini Trump, something.
I'm not really. I did not.
I saw that.
You saw that?
Yeah.
Oh, maybe. No, I thought he was kind of a crusader. I mean, maybe. So he's a populist, right? So he presented himself as a crusader against the establishment. So that's a very populist way of positioning, right? So it's pretty much Trumpy. Yeah.
Right. Without the 91 criminal investigations and 34 convictions. Difference in scale. So if I'm reading the tea leaves correctly, both Professor Fukuyama and Professor Takenaka are making an argument that this is about class politics, not identity politics. But what about Germany, Professor Iwama?
Yeah, thank you so much, and it's an honor for me to be here. I have never been worried about Germany more. It's really worrying, and because it's about the identity of two states that used to exist in today's Germany. I was there in West Berlin on the 9th of November 1989. That's really my starting point of my career as an academic, and I saw Germany's up of the unification euphoria, and in the down of the 90s they had a very hard economic problem, but then they came back in the 2000s. So every time I go back to Berlin showed me a different face. And it was a joy to see a sort of a multicultural blossoming Berlin in the early 2000s. It was really a joy for me to see Berlin multinational and very international in a totally different way from a full power occupied Berlin. And now they're in a deep crisis. Germany is facing a federal election on the 23rd of February 2025. They're going to dissolve their parliament in, I think it was 16th December. The three-party Olaf Scholz government is the first victim of Trump victory. He would not have done that had he not seen Trump declaring victory. I think that really pushed Olaf Scholz's shoulder to face up to his finance minister, Christian Lindner, who had been holding tight the budget because of the so-called debt brake that Germany has installed in the constitution. Now, it is written in the constitution, but it's not something that you can never bleach. You can change it if you think the situation is difficult enough, and they did that during the corona crisis. So they can do it again. There's a war going on in Europe. Ukraine is fighting for its existence against Russia. It's serious enough, and you would think that you can open the budget a little bit so Germany can rearm. It's not happening. And so seeing Trump declaring victory was the last thread, that was cut, and Scholz thought, this is the limit. We have to have a different team to face what's coming after Trump is inaugurated. But the timing is not great. They're not going to have a government when Trump is inaugurated in January. They will probably have at least several weeks of coalition building period, so it will be spring before Germany has a new government. And we don't know what kind of government there will be. There have been 3 local elections in September in the former eastern part of Germany. Now, it's terrible that we don't even have a name for these places that used to be called DDR, Democratic. And sometimes you call it former East Germany, sometimes you call it East Germany. You always feel some kind of strange pain in yourself when you speak about East Germany because of 40 years of dictatorship that was there. And people are divided because of this past. We all know that AfD, the far-right party, did pretty well in the 3 eastern elections. And the populist party, BSW, is also doing very well. And now this party has really the role to determine which coalition is possible or not. And this could be repeated on the federal level after the February election. We can't talk about what is possible in Germany after the election, but I can tell you that this has a very deep root. I mean, my first book was about Konrad Adenauer, and I really, it was really enlightening for me to see this face of Adenauer and his Westbindung, that he identifies himself, and Germany identifies itself with the Western values. And this is now in question. And because of the 2 paths that Germany has, I was never a fan of Angela Merkel. And I always sensed something different in her. Although she was a CDU leader, she was not an heir of Konrad Adenauer, although she was the heir of Helmut Kohl. In her foreign policy, she was always very forgiving to what both China and Russia was doing. And she worked very hard to strengthen the ties to both China and Russia, which I never liked. But looking back, I feel that this was, in her own way, her effort to somehow unite the 2 different pasts that this country has. Merkel was born in Hamburg, and a few days later her birth, she was moved to East Germany because of her father's job, and she stayed there until Germany unified. So her identity probably is Eastern Germany, and she speaks fluent Russian, and probably she knows a lot about Marxism-Leninism. And these past is still part of Germany, and they don't know how to reconcile themselves with this past. There's a historian called Katja Hoyer who has published a book about the history of East Germany, which came out first in English, and then it was translated into German. And it caused a controversy when it was translated into German, because she writes that there were also positive things about Eastern Germany. And this resounds in the hearts of those people who have memories of Eastern Germany, and the children of those parents who have good memories about Eastern Germany. It's natural that you were living there. You had good memories as well. But Germany as a state has denied legitimacy to whatever was in Eastern Germany politically. Everything is gone. And this is especially difficult for Germany in comparison to other former communist countries like Poland or even Hungary. They did it themselves, and they reformed it themselves. Eastern Germans feel that the Westerners came along and took everything away and enforced their system on them. And this resentment is coming out currently in all different forces. And so this the difficulty that the Germans face. They might just get along with some sort of grand coalition or even a three-party coalition of CDU, CSU, SPD, and the Greens that carries on the Federal Republic's tradition, which has a strong binding to the liberal Western tradition. But that doesn't solve the identity problem for Germany. Half of Germans' hearts still live in the communist era. And so integrating these two identities into a national German identity needs to happen before this problem of far right and populism goes away. That's why I think the German problem is, in a way, very philosophical, and we don't know how to face up to it. We don't have a solution yet. It doesn't help to say, you know, you illiberals, you're wrong, go away, because it's half the country, and they feel they have a place in this country which is not recognized. And so how to recreate a national identity out of two different pasts, which is the symbol of two different thoughts during the 20th century. I think that is a challenge that Germany is putting in front of you, and I don't have an answer.
Very complicated, and I won't ask you for the answer, although I want to. Okay, I think this has been fantastic, and
But I would like
yes.
to comment from
What do you think, Professor Fukuyama, about the German past?
Well, so first of all, I found that analysis very interesting, and I think that it is extremely worrisome, the kinds of gains that have been made. It has some echoes in other parts of Eastern Europe, I think, as well. So, you know, the PiS, the Law and Justice Party in Poland, also, I mean, they would never have nostalgia for, you know, the period when the Soviet Union dominated them, but they do have a certain nostalgia for, you know, the stability. The Hungarians are obviously just off the charts in terms of, you know, their particular form of nostalgia. So I think it's something that goes a little bit beyond just the German identity problem. But I guess the part you didn't mention is when you actually have to confront a United States that is returning to demands, you know, to spend more, but also not supportive of democratic values, and probably will symbolically make a lot of gestures towards the AfD. You know, that is a situation that's really not occurred, you know, previously, and I would say that is, you know, likely to happen sometime in the, you know, in the coming year. Again, that's one of the reasons why I think the American election was so, you know, was so important.
Thank you very much. So, anger, resentment, nostalgia are some key words that are popping out to me. Sounds very emotional. I suppose emotions in international politics and domestic politics are on the rise. I would like to open up to questions from the floor and answers from the panel. So if you have a question, please raise your hand high, and a mic will be brought to you. Introduce yourself by name and ask a precise and concise question. Who's first? Right here, yes, perfect.
Good afternoon, Professor Fukuyama. You're one of our required readings back in college, so it's wonderful listening to you in person. But my question is not on your most famous book, arguably, on your recent article. given the result of the U.S. election, and I think implicitly you've already answered it, do you think that it's still a good year for liberal democracy, the election year? Is it still a good year? And follow-up question, and perhaps the question can also be given to professors.
Please identify yourself.
Oh, sorry. I'm Michelle Castillo. I'm from the Philippines. Graduate student here under the Young Leaders Program. So that's the first question. Is the election year still a good year for the liberal democracy? And second is also for professors in GRIPS, how far are we from the next, given the decline in liberal democratic values, how far do you think are we from the next wave of democracy? Thank you.
Well, I published the article in Foreign Affairs about the year of elections, I believe in July. And at that point, I said, it's not as bad as people feared at the beginning of the year, but it all depends on the American election. And the American election did not, in my view, go well. But I do think that a point that I was trying to make in that article is that it is really important not to be overly pessimistic about the future of democracy, because that can easily become a self-fulfilling prophecy. And I think that what some of the elections, like the one in India, the one in Poland, Finland, I mean, there are a number of other countries, even in the European elections, Viktor Orban, didn't do as well as in previous elections. And I think, the point I was trying to make was that you can actually reverse some of these anti-democratic trends, but it takes the slow, boring work of campaigning, mobilizing people, and then ultimately voting. And if you somehow think that it's inevitable that these anti-democratic forces are going to win and you stay home, you're just contributing to their victory. And I think it's important for everybody to remember that the PiS was in power in Poland for 8 years, and they had a very strong coalition of some rather different liberal groups there, and they actually managed to win that election. And it's turning out it's hard to reverse some of the changes that the PiS made, but at least you've got a government that is fighting back in that way. So that's just a general admonition to everybody, is don't get too pessimistic, because as long as you're living in a country that remains democratic, where you actually can vote, there is a way to prevent further democratic erosion.
Optimism or hope is always key. And just to add to that, I think it's important to remember that Donald Trump won the popular vote, but not the majority vote. And there's a clear distinction there. He won more votes than Harris, but not the majority of voters, right? So in the end, it's 49-48, right? In the end, of course, the outcome will be shambolic, right? But it's still fairly close. Next question. Let's go right here in the middle.
Maybe following on from that last point, are some domestic political systems proving better for protecting against liberal democracies than others? And are some democratic electoral systems and rules better protected from populism and authoritarianism?
Well, yeah, so this is the bread and butter of what comparativists think about. In the United States, one of the causes of polarization is our electoral system. We have a first-past-the-post, plurality voting system, which, according to Duverger's law, typically produces a two-party system. Now, we've had that since the beginning of the American Republic, and we've had two parties since the beginning, but we haven't been as polarized as we have been over the last 10 years, or, you could take that back to the 1990s. So it's not simply the electoral system. I think that one of the things that happened was when we moved to popular primaries in both parties after the 1970s, that accelerated the polarization because the only people that vote in primaries are activists, and that pushed both parties in a more extreme direction. On the other hand, there are other aspects of the American system that I think continue to be fairly important checks. The federal judiciary is very difficult to change because federal judges have lifetime appointments, and you get these people like Eileen Cannon in Florida. But on the whole, the federal judiciary did not buy the election denialism that Trump was trying to push in the immediate aftermath of the 2020 election. American federalism is very powerful, and I think that California, the state of California, where I live, is gearing up for a big fight with the incoming Trump administration because there has already been this tussle over environmental standards where, California could kind of set standards for the whole country just because it's so big and powerful, and Trump took aim at it in the last administration. He's going to do it again, but I'm not sure that they can actually get California to weaken its environmental standards, from Washington. So I do think that there are good things and bad things about the way the American system works. But I would just say that in general, I've felt that presidential systems, first of all, are not as good as parliamentary ones. And I think that plurality voting systems are also not as good as either, PR or the Australian, limited preferential vote, and that our institutions would not have gotten to the current state they were if those things had changed.
If I may piggyback off that question, in the U.S., this election cycle, estimates have total spending at about $15 billion, and the presidential election itself at $5.5 billion. We also have the entrance of the world's richest man, Elon Musk, who's become very political. What do you think? What do you make of this big money in American politics?
It's a funny thing because for all that money, like Kamala Harris spent, a couple $2 billion just in the last month of the election, and it didn't do her much good, as it seems. And so first of all, look, it's ridiculous that we allow this amount of money to be spent on elections, and many other successful democracies have campaign finance rules that prevent that sort of thing from happening, and we don't because our Supreme Court, declared that spending money on elections was protected by the First Amendment, which I think was a very questionable decision. And changing that, unfortunately, is going to be very hard because it's hard to change the Constitution. But democracies don't have to get into this kind of arms race over campaign spending. The thing about the oligarchs is really disturbing. It's not just that there are a lot of oligarchs, but it's the combination of their oligarchy plus media power. I actually chaired a Stanford working group on platform scale back in 2020, which was looking at the fact that the tech sector has created these big platforms, very small number, very big and very powerful platforms. And I said, or we said in our report that platform power was like a loaded gun sitting on the table in front of you, and you were hoping that the person sitting opposite you would not pick up the gun and shoot you with it, because it gave that person that kind of power. And we actually said, for example, one of the big platforms could be bought by an oligarch who would then try to use it to sway an American election. Think of that possibility.
Impossible.
Yeah, impossible, right. And, I think that's exactly what happened, which is why I actually think that these antitrust measures to weaken platform power are a good thing. That would lead to a separate discussion on tech policy, but,
Professor Takenaka.
About this safeguarding, as regards to the safeguard of democracy, you question. As a comparativist, parliamentary system, I think, if you choose parliamentary system, I think it's a safer option than presidential system because you can switch the head of the government if he or she does something something nasty. And also, since president is directly elected, the candidate has can use various means to directly appeal to the people, right? So if the top of the government is indirectly elected by the parliamentarians, then it's much safer, because your colleagues can figure out who is good and who is bad. And addressing the question about this, this student from Philippines, about the next wave of democratization. I am a believer of modernization theory. That is, as countries develop, that country is more likely to become democratic. So I think many Asian countries have experienced significant degree of economic development. So we have hopes, and I'm wondering when Singapore becomes a democracy, right?
Democracy plays the long game. Great questions. Next question. Okay, let's go here.
Thank you very much for the wonderful session. My name is Hiroko Ueno. I'm a PhD student here at GRIPS, Science, Technology, and Innovation Policy Program. I have a question to Dr. Fukuyama. What do American people think about appointing family members or good friends to important positions of the government? I don't think Japanese people here don't favor that.
Well, I think it's a terrible idea. I think that the characteristic of a modern state is the fact that it is impersonal, that power is related to your formal status as a citizen, that people are selected on merit and not because of who their relatives are. And so, we've seen a going backwards in many societies away from that kind of impersonal modernity to governments basically built around friends and family. And unfortunately, that's what we saw under Donald Trump in his first administration.
Okay, thank you very much. Next question. Professor Pechko in the back.
Thank you so much. I'm a faculty member here, and I have a question to Professor Fukuyama. Isn't the fact that Trump was elected testament to the fact that American democracy works? And should we really consider American people to be incapable of basically deciding what's good for them? And my second question is about Kamala Harris. I've been watching American election very closely, and I really could never understand what she was proposing or what she wanted. Do you think that she would have been a better choice? Thank you.
Well, first of all, American democracy works. When you say that the American people didn't know what's good for them, in a certain way they did. What they were not thinking about was institutions and the long-term health of the democracy. What they were worried about was the southern border and inflation. From an academic standpoint, we say, well, these are transitory things. They can be changed by policy. That's not how you should vote when your fundamental institution is being threatened. But that's a very academic position, and not many ordinary voters think like that. And so I in a sense, I don't blame the American people for saying, I can't buy a house because interest rates are so high, and every time I go to the grocery store, it takes up my entire budget, and I really don't like the party that, brought me that. So that's, I just think that that's the political reality we're facing. You are right that Kamala Harris was not terribly specific. I actually think that, for example, if, there's one interview she gave where she was asked, how you differentiate yourself from Joe Biden? And she said, I can't think of a single thing where that was one of the dumbest things I mean, if there's one mistake, big mistake she made, it was that assertion. But that's also, it's kind of Biden's fault, because if he had dropped out of the race earlier, or if he decided not to run for a second term, you would have had a full competitive primary among Democrats. The Democrats have a lot of very good candidates that were not Kamala Harris. I mean, I think under the circumstance, she did much better than I expected her to, but there are other people, and, you know, like many people said, if she had been tested in a primary contest, she would have, you know, I think been forced to develop much more substantive positions that would have given people a positive reason to vote for her.
Thank you very much. Next question. Yes, the gentleman here to the right. Please introduce yourself.
My question is for Professor. Thank you, Professor. I'm Vipin. I'm from India, here in the Young Leaders Program. Professor, is it not a sign of a mature or maturing democracy when there are no set vote banks? People who earlier vote for Democrats vote for Republicans and vice versa? Or are we thinking that American democracy is going the primitive way? Is it not a sign of a maturing democracy that people are changing their votes after successive governments?
No, yeah, that's true. I think that, I mean, if you want to look for positive things that have happened, you know, one thing is that, yeah, people can actually make up their minds, and they are not, you know, Trump voters were swayed by a lot of demagogic appeals he was making, but a lot of them were also voting on kind of bread and butter sorts of issues. The other thing is really this business, going back to the question about money, that I think it is appalling how much money was spent, but it is also the case that, like I said, it didn't really seem to make that much difference. And actually, a lot of the money that came into both candidates came from small donors rather than big, you know, oligarchs. And both of those are, I think, sort of positive things about American democracy. But you're kind of avoiding the big elephant in the room, is how can you vote for somebody that actually, you know, refused to leave office the last time he was president, and not care about that, or somehow sweep that under the rug. And that's something I find, you know, I do blame the American voter for not kind of recognizing the importance of that.
And I wonder if it's too much to ask voters to be the ones to protect democracy. What do you think?
Well, but who's going to protect it if they don't, you know? I mean, you know, look, the elites are important, but ultimately, you know, the United States is a democratic, I mean, that's the thing about what happened to the Republican Party. The elites really did not control it. It really was driven by Trump's being able to generate just fanatical grassroots support. And, you know, in a way that was quite an impressive, you know, demonstration of, you know, sort of the bottom-up nature of American democracy.
Yes, I agree. And it might be a failure of the elites. And I suppose we are now hoping that the institutions can hold.
No, that's right.
Next question. Oh, how about here up front on the left?
Thank you for your great discussion. I'm a strategic study program member, Fuji, from Self-Defense Force, and I want to ask about the influence of social media. Social networking apps, on one hand, seem to support democratic values, such as creating space for diverse voices. However, we've also seen a surge in populism and the breakdown of civil debate. So the first question is, do you see strong linkage between social media and populism? And the second question is, does stronger regulation of social media sites align with democratic values such as free speech? Thank you.
We've been debating this ever since 2016, and almost everybody, when they're recounting why democracy is weakened around the world, they say, and there's social media, as if it's an obvious truism. I think it is true, but I think it's true in certain very specific ways that social media has greatly weakened elite control over certain categories of information. And it's also compartmentalized the kind of information that people see. So, for example, a lot of the really damaging information about Donald Trump, his chief of staff, John Kelly, basically talked about his disparaging soldiers that had been killed, in battle. And if you were in the right-wing media space, you simply never would have heard any of that information. And that's how 70% of Republicans can come to believe that the last election was stolen, because they simply are consuming very different facts than, voters that consume, more left-leaning sources of information. There's a very good book that was written by a former colleague of mine at Stanford, Renee DiResta, it's really about the rise of influencers, where, again, it's a sign of the loss of elite control over information that formerly you had statistical agencies, universities, various trusted sources from which people derive their factual understanding of the world. And today, you have internet influencers where the primary criteria of truth is how many likes you get. And that obviously allows people to live in a kind of fantasy world where, their perception of reality is completely different from that of their fellow citizens. And so that's obviously something that, is very bad for democracy. Now, can elites regain control of that narrative? I really doubt it. In the United States, after the 2016 election, there were a lot of efforts to regulate misinformation. In fact, my university at Stanford, we had an Stanford Internet Observatory that was trying to keep track of election misinformation. And the Republicans interpreted this as an attack on them, and they went after us. When they got control of the House, there's one particular committee that subpoenaed, the people that were running it was an academic research program. They subpoenaed the leaders of it. They subpoenaed all the students that were working as research assistants, and they basically succeeded in shutting it down because what we thought we were doing was empirical academic research on election misinformation. They saw it as a partisan political attack on the Republican Party. And I think that has made all of the big platforms step away from their efforts to moderate misinformation, because the country is so polarized that people on the right interpret that as a direct attack on themselves, not as trying to improve the quality of information. So that's the problem, is that, you can moderate and certify information only if people trust the certifiers. And in the United States, we're way past the point where, you've got a trusted group of people that, will be credible in that respect.
Okay, let me go to this side to make sure I'm not ignoring stage right. How about in the back on the right? Yes.
All right, thank you, Professor. We have been a bit optimistic that maybe the rising again of Trump to the office of the presidency in America might as well bring peace, especially after the surge of Ukraine, Russia, and then in the Middle East as well. So I don't know, what's your opinion on that?
Well, I think it's not going to happen, unfortunately. I mean, Ukraine is the most painful story for me because I've spent a lot of time in Ukraine over the last decade, and I have a lot of Ukrainian friends. And, Trump says he could get a peace deal signed in 24 hours. What that means is basically he pressures Ukraine to give in to to Russian, it might as well be Soviet, but Russian demands, for Ukrainian territory, and agree to forswear any kind of future NATO guarantee. And Putin will agree to that, and Ukraine will lose 20% of its territory. And then when Putin feels stronger, they'll start the war up again, and you won't have peace, and you may not have Ukraine at that point. And as I said, in the Middle East, if you didn't like Biden's policy for being too pro-Israel, you're really going to hate Trump's policy, because he, I think, is really very unlikely to try to restrain Israel. The question of annexing the West Bank actually was floated during the first Trump administration, and I think because they wanted to get to the Abraham Accords and so forth, they basically shut that down. Who knows what's going to happen in the next 4 years? You could get outcomes like that. So if that's peace, then it's peace at the expense of a lot of people.
If the United States withdraws support for Ukraine, will Germany pick up the slack?
Well, depends on what kind of Germany, and we don't know what we'll get after the election, so it will take some time. I'm not very optimistic there, but let's not give up hope.
Choice words of the day, hope. Yes, center in the back.
Thank you, Professor Fukuyama, and all the panelists today. My name is Lee. I'm a PhD student here. I actually have a question for all three of. Actually, three separate questions for each panelist here. Sorry about that. First, a question to Professor Fukuyama. For the sake of argument, let's assume that American democracy preserves 4 years later, and that Trump more or less observes the constitutions and finishes his second term and leaves the White House. In that case, we've mentioned you've talked about Trump being uniquely charismatic as essentially as a propagandist in a way that no other politicians has been able to successfully replicate so far. What do you see a GOP? What do you think the GOP will look like 4 years later, hypothetically, if it don't run Trump again or one of Trump's children, hypothetically speaking? My question to Professor Takenaka is, when you're talking about issues that are happening in Japan with Japanese politics, the developing anti-establishment sentiment, I was reminded there have always been kind of weird anti-establishment, unorthodox political parties in Japan over recent years, such as the anti-NHK party. Do you think of is this a continuing trend of Japanese politics showing symptoms, as maybe you would call it, in one way or another, despite the fact that Japanese politics is relatively stable now, as to say? And finally, a question to Iwama-sensei. There are recent news about, I think it was the German parliament attempt, at least certain sections from the German parliament, trying to essentially to quote Constitution to ban AfD on grounds of them being an unconstitutional party. If that were to happen, do you think we can see a reversal of the populist or even far-right trend in Germany, or will they simply find another vessel to express their ideas in German public political spaces? Thank you. That are my questions.
Okay. Well, first of all, I think your scenario of a kind of normal 4 years and Trump just stepping down is very unlikely. And I think that actually, if you want an optimistic scenario, so I think American democracy will survive him. It will be weakened and tarnished around the edges in terms of democratic norms, but it's going to survive. And if you want an optimistic scenario, Trump will actually try to pull off the two things he's promised, across-the-board tariffs and mass deportation of illegal immigrants. These are going to be so difficult and they're going to cause so much backlash. I mean, the tariff policy is going to lead immediately to a return of inflation, which people hate. And in fact, the bond market is already beginning to signal that they're expecting, much higher interest rates and inflation rates now that Trump has been reelected. And it could be that in 2026, when we have the midterm elections, the Democrats will come roaring back and recapture both houses of Congress. I mean, if you want an optimistic scenario to close this discussion with, I think that would be my candidate for it, much more likely than Trump just turning into some kind of normal Republican politician.
Yeah, thank you very much for raising the issue of this anti-NHK, NHK に反対すると。I think it was, so we had the Reiwa Shinsengumi. It, I think, also very much has anti-regime attitudes. And also we had anti-NHK. And then we have Sansei Party. And now we also have the Japanese Conservative Party. So if you take this, I tend to take evolutionary perspective of political event. And so I think now, so the left, I think this I think this is really anti-existing political parties as well as anti-existing ministries. Okay, and it started out with Reiwa. It started with the left wing because Reiwa is very much populist. We need more redistribution. You should raise lower tax rates. It makes a commitment to eliminate the consumption tax at all. Okay, and then so it spread now to the right wing, right side of the political spectrum, with Sanseto and Japanese Conservative Party. They are very nationalistic. And I'm very sorry I regret to say this in front of a lot of foreign students, but Sanseto is anti-immigration, right? So this is really the first anti-immigration party we observe in Japan. So I think I think these anti-existing, the growth of anti-existing parties are connected with, as I've said, with the dissatisfaction of the economic conditions and living standards. So I think it might continue. Okay.
Yeah. Declaring AFD unconstitutional, it's technically possible. And, well, it might push away the problem for several years. But I think the fundamental question remains. So most probably it will find other ways of expression. It doesn't mean that it is meaningless. It will buy time. And you don't always find talented leaders. Donald Trump is a talented leader, right? So I don't think, even the German AFD hasn't really found a talented leader yet, but they are becoming popular. So declaring them unconstitutional might put them out of action for several years, which might buy a breathing time for the existing parties. But I think the problem of identity that I mentioned in the beginning, that remains, and it cries for solution, and it's a huge challenge, I think, inside Europe and inside Germany.
Thank you very much. A fascinating discussion. Let me use the dictator's privilege of a moderator and ask the final question, very short and a concise one. In a word or a single sentence, what worries you most about the future of democracy. Professor Fukuyama?
I'm not going to be able to do this in one sentence. What's interesting, worrisome about this current time is how intertwined the domestic and the international situation is, where the domestic polarization is lined up in a way with the geopolitical polarization, and that's very unusual. And I think that geopolitically, the extreme polarization and the rise of Donald Trump weakens the United States and destabilizes the international system at the very moment when you're seeing the coalescing of an anti-democratic coalition between Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran. So, in a way, it's kind of hard to answer your question, what's the one thing that worries me the most? What worries me actually is the coming together of both the domestic rise of Trump and the international rise of this anti-democratic coalition.
Thank you very much. Very worrying indeed. Professor Takenaka?
I'm worried about ever-growing economic disparity. That is, I think that in the background of various political phenomena we observe in the States, and also the various political phenomena we observe in Japan. But I think, I have exaggerated this rise of extreme left and right a bit too much. So I think that most Japanese are very conservatives and they are moderate. So I think there is much more. I think that their expansion. I think there is a limit. I think to the seats they will gain. I think in that way, Japanese democracy will be much more stable compared with some other countries, other traditional democratic countries.
Professor Iwama?
I'm worried about Trump, but not for the future of democracy, for the future of the world. World can exist even if it's not democratic, but Trump can cause economic, social, political, diplomatic, all sorts of troubles that reverberates in all parts of the world, democratic or not. America has that capacity to do that. So I'm worried, and we need to be prepared.
Thank you very much. I would like to relinquish my role as moderator now and ask Professor Iwama for closing remarks. Thank you.
Yes, well, thank you all for coming today. I will not ask how many of you had read Francis Fukuyama before coming here, but now you've met him, and take it as an occasion to start reading and start thinking. Ultimately, it's up to you people to change the world and make it a better place. It's not us, it's each individual of you to make this world a better place. And I really I'm glad if this occasion served as an opportunity for you people to start reading and thinking and reading books. So thank you very much, Dr. Fukuyama.